been getting a lot of questions about debt, and apparently people think that, gee, if there's a default, that leads to revolution, and that's how everything will come crashing down. It's a very nice theory, but it's simply not the case. There have been plenty of countries that have defaulted on their debts. I mean, you've had defaults in 1931. You've had, defaults after World War II. I mean, those things are just modern examples. But even if we go back and we look at the Roman Empire, all right, lasted for over 1,000 years, they had no national debt. How did the government actually function if it didn't borrow money? Very simple. It basically had the monopoly of producing money. So it owned all the mines, and it would produce the gold, the silver, etc. And that's how they funded it. They didn't have a central bank. How did they distribute it? They simply basically used it to pay the troops, and that was the means of. They would then spend the money, and it would then circulate within the economy. So there have been many different types of models, but to come up and claim that, oh, if there's a debt default and that's it, and then there'll be some sort of revolution. Even the American Revolution was not over debt. It was basically no taxation without representation. Most of your revolutions are over taxation, not debt. So that's a very, very significant point to make. Even the French Revolution, it was over taxes. The people were overburdened, etc. I mean, it was a popular slogan, that from Marie Antoinette, "Let them eat cake," which was the crust of around of basically just the crust around the pan that it was baked in. So. We have to understand, I mean, this whole experiment with debt is a serious problem. There's no question about that. But this is also something that's fairly new in history, that governments have, created this perpetual debt, and they fund it time after time. Back in the 15th century, we had the city of Maine, which is where the Gutenberg press was invented. So that created a technology boom. Everybody started printing things, and the politicians thought, wow, this is never going to end. And they were raising taxes, and then they started borrowing money, and basically they weren't bonds, they were annuities. So they were borrowing money at that stage of the game because they thought the tax revenue would just never end. But they kept raising taxes, the rich left. The city then ended up with people who couldn't pay the taxes, kind of like New York City as we're watching. And then what the end result was, they defaulted. When they defaulted, okay, fine, it was foreigners who basically held debt. They marched in, and eventually they, sacked the city and burned it to the ground. I mean, but these are not necessarily issues that are prevalent throughout every sort of revolution or crisis. There was definitely the same thing we see, fiscal mismanagement by the politicians. Even the Pope excommunicated the politicians for borrowing money wildly like they did. But what we're facing here is something much different. We've never had a serious crisis of basically debt like this before. Like I said, Rome didn't borrow money, etc. So, but there have been many financial crises throughout history, and we can see how they have affected. And I mean that they're even recorded putting in wage and price controls by Hammurabi. I mean, back in Babylonian times, you wouldn't do that unless there was a serious inflationary crisis. So there have been many of these things throughout, from Babylonian times, or Greek times, or Roman times, etc. There's plenty of these financial crises that we can draw reference to and understand how do people respond in such events? This particular time, the politicians have been borrowing relentlessly. And as I have said before, taxes really are no longer necessary. We needed taxes when money was physical coins. They had to get some back to basically respend it again. But what are they doing now? They just create the money at this stage. So why do we even have taxes? You know, so much of the economy is all about, you know, hunting down people looking for taxes. They're shutting down the global economy, you know, mainly all because of taxes. They're moving towards digital currency to shut down the underground economy so they can get taxes. But if we're just printing money to cover our expenses anyhow, all right, I've shown charts, which I'll illustrate here, that at times 70% of the national debt has been accumulative interest. So it was not something going out there to, you know, pay for schools and orphans and help, you know, build the roads, etc. It was basically just going out the back door to the bankers. So borrowing money, in theory, they thought, okay, fine, it comes back to this quantity theory of money, that if we don't increase the supply of money, we borrow instead, then it's not going to be less inflationary. But that has not been the case. All right, so what we really need to look at here is it's the taxes that create revolution. And this is the danger that we're moving into. The governments are all looking to hunt down taxes everywhere they possibly can. Moving to digital currency is to kill the underground economy. So to them, it's everything. I mean, fine, you have, you know, crime on one side and prostitution, right down to you're hiring the girl next door to be the babysitter. How do you pay her? Does she take MasterCard or Visa? So the ramifications that these people are looking at are quite significant. And not everybody has a bank account, etc. And the EU passed a law saying it's a right to have a bank account. It's all because they're trying to move to this digital currency, because they're concerned about the future, that they can't keep this system going. My argument all along has been basically we're going to end up defaulting. So do you default and wipe out all the pension funds and end up with a totalitarian state? Or do we step back and say, okay, fine, let's look at this and do a real debt to equity swap, as we would with any company that's in trouble, all right? We issue shares basically to swap out the debt. Here, be very simple. The same type of process can take place. The government can relinquish the debt. We issue coupons, and the coupons basically can be used to invest in domestic equities, period. All right? Then we get rid of the debt. They shouldn't be allowed to borrow ever again. And we should cap government expenditure to basically at maximum 5% of GDP on an annual basis. You're always going to have inflation. You have to have inflation because that's how the economy grows. All these people that say, oh, gee, you know, inflation's bad, etc. But by the way, I want my house to go up and I want my wages to increase. I mean, you can't have it both ways. If you want a wage increase and you want your house to appreciate, okay, that causes inflation. If you don't want inflation and you want austerity, okay, fine, then you're never going to get a raise. Your house is always going to be worth the same price forever. And these are the two different types of systems. But people want to make money from their investments and their house and wages. Gee, I should get more this year. But at the same time, then they come back, oh, well, I don't want the inflation. You can't have it both ways. All right, this is the fundamental economic model. So the debt crisis that we are facing is significant, but does it lead to revolution? All right, historically, that's not really the impetus behind a revolution. It's taxation. And this is the mistake that they're really making, to constantly go after and increasing taxes and taxing everything they possibly can. All right, so This is the real danger, and you can see what happens. Just as everybody fled because they're raising taxes in Maine, they're fleeing New York, California, dramatically. I mean, it's getting to be quite significant. They're moving all largely to Texas or to Florida. And the three main states that they're leaving from are New York, Illinois, and California. So this is what we're really looking at. It's going to be taxation that causes the real crisis. It's not the debt. Most of the average person on the street does not hold any of the government debt. But it leads to artificial inflation or interest rates where we're getting a huge gap. You know, we have government interest rates at historic lows because the central banks buy them. But you go to a bank and try and borrow at the same rate or even just 1 point higher, and you can't. So in Europe, I mean, the government's paying negative interest rates. You know, you have to look at these things realistically. So what are we facing is more of a tax crisis, which is what's going to bring everything down. So I hope this explains it a little bit better. It's not just simply debt. Thank you.